Hi, everyone. As I have had the chance to talk with many of you about your project ideas, I have been reminded of a theory that we don't always cover in family communication courses, but it's a communication theory that is relevant to some of the questions that you all are asking, so I thought it was worth discussing here. This might be familiar territory to those of you who've taken courses in media, um, but for others of you, this might be brand new. This is cultivation theory. It is the brainchild of George Gerbner. Gerbner, Gerbner. And the theory had its origins in the 1970s. The theory is one of our earliest attempts at a media effects theory that targeted television. In a nutshell, what the theory proposes is the idea that television became at one point our society's storyteller. And along with that role of storyteller came the potential to create positive and negative, accurate and inaccurate perceptions of the world around us in the minds of the audience. People who are heavy television viewers are exposed to lots of violence and, as a consequence, tend to see the world as a more violent place than it actually is. We'll talk about that in a little more detail over the next few minutes. Gerbner's work primarily dealt with that one variable, violence. However, other people have picked up the mantle of cultivation theory and argued that it could be applied to multiple concepts because media in general and television in particular are so widespread that they can exert influence on our attitudes about, well, just about anything. We'll talk about that in a little more detail too. As I mentioned early on, Gerbner's work looked primarily at violence, and more specifically, he was looking at violence in news media. And what he did was he quantitatively measured instances of TV violence represented in news media over a period of several years, and he found that in this particular time frame, we're talking in the 70s, excuse me, that the number of images of violence didn't change much year to year. He found that over half of primetime television programs contained some violence or a threat of violence. It would be interesting to look today and see whether those numbers still hold up, but I wouldn't be surprised to see whether they've actually increased. I wouldn't be surprised to see that they have increased since then. He found that two-thirds of the major characters in television shows were involved in some act of violence, whether as the perpetrator or as the victim. Another interesting point that he notes is that television, at least in the time when he was measuring this, tended to place certain groups in a position of what he calls double jeopardy. That he noticed that there were some groups, in particular minority groups, who would simultaneously be underrepresented and over victimized, which again would influence those people's perceptions of their social worlds. So here's what he did. Here's what Gerbner did in terms of measurement. He divided groups of television viewers into categories. A light television viewer is someone, per his definition, who watched 2 hours of TV a day or less, but no more than 2 hours. The heavy viewers were people who watched 4 or more hours a day. So we have this middle range that he doesn't account for. He wants to look at the extremes and see whether there is what he calls a cultivation differential between those two extremes. And um, for those of you who may be taking a research methods course or who have taken a research methods course, you might find it worth noting that Gerbner's work includes no control group. There is no group that he finds that has no exposure to TV at all, in part because that would make this research pretty darn hard to do. How much difficulty would you encounter trying to find a group of people who watched no television at all, excuse me, in a day today where 98% of the households in the US have at least one television, and where over 75% of them have at least two? But here's what Gerbner did. He conducted surveys, he constructed surveys and distributed them to his research sample, and he measured violence. First, in terms of the number of instances, in terms of the amount of time people viewed television. And he surveyed people to measure violence based on what they perceived as their chances of being the victim of violence, their fear of walking alone at night, their perceptions of the activity of police, and their general mistrust of people. So he conducts these surveys in many separate studies with some co-authors, uh, and finds that viewers who are heavy TV viewers are significantly different from light viewers. Heavy viewers overestimate the potential that they will be involved with police in some way or another. They overestimate the amount of criminal activity in their communities. They overestimate the percentage of law enforcement officers. They believe there are more police out there than there really are. And people who are heavy viewers tend to be less trusting of the people around them and of their surroundings. Taken together, Gerbner uses the term the mean world syndrome to describe this phenomenon. Heavy TV viewers are prone to developing the mean world syndrome. Well, why does this matter? Well, it matters because people engage in actions based on their perceptions. And if we have media sources that are impacting those perceptions, then this is something we need to know. For some of you who've been asking questions about family communication by looking at media images of families, well, these images matter because if there is a cultivation effect, what you're arguing is that heavy exposure to media messages about families can impact our attitudes towards various elements of family interaction. Um, on one hand, this can be, on one hand, this can be analogous to the notion that representation matters. Uh, we can look at groundbreaking television shows and studies of television shows that broke barriers by introducing groups of people to mainstream America at a time when those people didn't have access to people from those groups. I have heard from students before who've told me that the Huxtable family on The Cosby Show was the first black family they had ever known. And pardon me for dating myself with that reference. Now we're seeing, in addition to ethnic diversity, a broader range of diversity in family types. And one might wonder whether showing audiences a more varied set of family types might cultivate attitudes, positive or negative. We're not worrying about that at this point. We're worrying about whether the media messages have an effect on the audience's perceptions of the world. And cultivation theory is one of those theories that for some people provides a satisfactory answer by saying yes. That through the process of mainstreaming, by presenting these images over and over again, we normalize them in the minds of an audience. Uh, so it is possible that someone who has no access to anyone who is of an ethnically different group than them might see through watching more diverse families on television um, an idea being cultivated that those families aren't that different from mine, that these people who have family lives and values that match mine, or that in some ways don't match mine. Um, Lots of studies have looked at various TV shows in terms of their potential impact through representation. Uh, Gosh, the first that comes to mind for me now, perhaps, is Kenya Harris's Blackish. Mm. Which takes a more modernized look at an African American family that deals with some issues that the Huxtables of Cosby shows of years past didn't look at. So we have this mainstreaming process whereby the media images we see become normalized. It's not watching one, this isn't a magic bullet media theory. This isn't saying that one episode of The Cosby Show is going to change your worldview. But 9 seasons of it might. Now, every theory has its strengths and weaknesses. Cultivation theory is no different. There have been critiques of the theory. There are some methodological concerns there. For for Gerbner's original work, um, the question of how to define and measure violence is a problematic one. And if we want to look at other variables in other types of media text, if you wanted to look, say, at unrealistic portrayals of, well, if you wanted to look at romantic comedies, or romantic comedy storylines in American sitcoms, and you wanted to see whether exposure to those kinds of shows cultivated unrealistic um, attitudes and expectations in the minds of viewers, then there has to be a way to operationalize that. What are we defining as realistic? And so, for someone studying cultivation from that perspective, or from looking at those kinds of variables, using the theory requires constantly gathering the latest information on those particular variables, on what constitutes a realistic relationship, what constitutes a realistic boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy meets girl story, to use kind of um, the old archetype of romantic comedies. And in what is perhaps the biggest critique of cultivation theory, most of the work on cultivation only finds a slight to moderate cultivation effect. So there might be other factors out there that are more influential in determining our attitudes toward the world, about what makes us perceive the world as being so mean and scary. Cultivation theory gives us an answer, but not one that provides a full explanation. It's a partial one. And so that leaves the door open for us to consider what other elements could be contributing to our beliefs in how the world is and how the world works. Maybe our families of origin convey values and beliefs to us that, in conjunction with media messages, might create that mean world syndrome. Uh, Again, though, cultivation gives us a part of that answer, but not all of it. And for some people, that means we need to tweak cultivation theory. And for some people, it means that cultivation theory needs to be scrapped altogether. I will leave that for you to consider, and especially if you are thinking about media portrayals of families in your respective papers.